This is Progressive Radio, a weekly conversation hosted by Matthew Rothschild, editor of The Progressive Magazine, a leading voice for peace and social justice. For more information about Progressive Radio or The Progressive Magazine, log on to our website at progressive.org.
I'm Matt Rothschild, and welcome to Progressive Radio. My guest today is none other than Christopher Hitchens, formerly of The Nation magazine, still a contributing writer to Vanity Fair. He's the author of a new book out called God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. Many of you probably know Christopher Hitchens for his support of the Iraq War, but love him or revile him, you can't dismiss him so easily, and he still has, if not one foot on the left bank, at least a footprint on the left bank. So, Christopher Hitchens, welcome to Progressive Radio.
Very nice of you to have me.
Well, let's get right to it. The Iraq War, do you have any second thoughts on supporting it?
No.
Why is that?
Well, I think it was, as well as a just war, a necessary war. In fact, I would, in a sense, want to say an inevitable one. There was going to have to be a confrontation with Saddam Hussein. I thought we should have picked the timing of it rather than he. And there was going to be a maimed and traumatized Iraq in our future. It's a responsibility we couldn't walk around or evade, and I thought it was essential to engage sooner rather than later.
But it wasn't a just war in the traditional teachings of just war, anyway, in that there was no attack or imminent attack, for that matter. So there was no cause for the war. So what do you mean by just war?
No, I don't think so. I mean, the Saddam Hussein regime was one of unsleeping aggression against its neighbors. I could back up perhaps a bit. There are four conditions, it seems to me, under which a state can be deemed to have lost its sovereignty and be open to international intervention to remove its government. One is if it invades the territory or occupies the territory of neighboring countries. The other is if it violates the Genocide Convention, at least for those countries who are signatories to that convention, which we are. It's mandatory to take action either to prevent or to punish genocide. If this said government violates the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and if it gives support, encouragement, and shelter to international terrorist organizations. Now, Iraq is multiply guilty on all those four counts.
It hadn't invaded a country for years.
Sorry?
On the first one, it hadn't. I don't want to defend Saddam Hussein. I don't defend Saddam Hussein, and I do think your argument, or the argument for people who claimed there was a humanitarian urgency to this, isn't something that can be dismissed out of hand. But he hadn't invaded, as far as your first point goes, a country in quite some time.
Oh, but he was in the habit, all right. And he was, in my view, there's no doubt of it. I know it's a hotly disputed proposition, but there's no question in my mind that he was still seeking to rearm with weapons of mass destruction, and that he was very actively engaged in trying to support Islamist terrorism in the region as well. And really the mistake was not to have taken him out in 1991 when the opportunity would have afforded itself.
But surely,
I would add, having stipulated what those four legalities are and principles are, that above all it was important after 2001 to change the balance of power in the Middle East. And Iraq's a keystone state.
But this isn't a humanitarian argument, then. This is just a geopolitical, realpolitik argument.
Yeah, well, also, it's a war for oil. I mean, don't forget. That oil is very important. And it's not...
But that's not how the war was sold to us.
It's how it was sold by me.
You said we should go for the oil. I
wasn't a supporter of it. I was an advocate of it, if you recall. It's very important, yes, that a keystone state between the Wahhabi theocracy of Saudi Arabia and the Shia theocracy of Iran, with both of which we're also going to have some kind of confrontation sooner or later, a keystone state, a choke point of the world economy, in the private hands of a psychopathic crime family, not a situation that could go on for very much longer, or should have been allowed, in fact.
Christopher Hitchens, my recollection is, though, that you undersold the oil argument and sold the humanitarian argument above all. And certainly Bush wasn't talking about oil until recently.
Well, no one's allowed to talk about oil for a reason that I simply don't understand. You heard people saying, you must have seen them, you may even have been one, saying things like no blood for oil, as if oil isn't worth fighting for. I don't understand this at all.
Well, that we should go invade another country
I said,
for their resources.
I thought that was very. Whenever I was asked, I thought that was extremely important, because we want to help, among other things, undermine and undercut the monopoly on oil that is currently held by the Saudi Arabians. And changing the balance of force and power in that way is very important to us. So it should be, anyway. It's certainly important to me.
Well, I must say I'm less persuaded or tugged by this argument than by the moral Saddam's a terrible dictator, we got to help those poor Iraqis.
Well, there's absolutely no reason to soft pedal that approach either. I mean, I've been a very passionate advocate for many years now of the autonomy of the Kurdish people of the region, not just in Iraq either, but in Syria, Iran, and Turkey. We had a responsibility, I think, to defend that enclave that we'd helped to create in the north.
And what about Turkey now attacking Iraqis there, or threatening to attack?
Well, I mean, I think one thing we can say a superpower is capable of doing is telling the Turks to keep their hands off Iraq, which so far we've been successful in doing. But I wouldn't mind hearing the administration say that a bit more loudly. And I think it's also important that we keep reminding the Turks, as the European Union has been doing, that there is another people living inside their borders, Kurdish people whose rights must be respected as well.
But it sounds to me like you're kind of recapitulating the Carter doctrine that, there's oil in the Persian Gulf, it's key to the U.S. national security interest. The U.S. can go do what it wants to grab that oil.
Pretty much, yeah.
And don't you feel?
I mean, that's putting it rather crudely, but I don't have any quarrel with that point of view. No.
To me, I have a huge quarrel with it because I think
I'll tell you why. Because it's for this reason also. As everyone knows, the problem with Iraq up till now has been that it's almost been innately dictatorial, its system, and thus aggressive and expansionist as well, because the Sunni minority, of which Saddam was the clan leader of a minority of that minority, the Tikrit mafia, doesn't have any oil under the provinces where it lives. Therefore, it has to govern the Shia and Kurdish majority by force in order to have access to the oil. Now, since the liberation of Iraq, quite a lot of new prospecting for oil has been done. And, for example, in Anbar province, huge Sunni province between Baghdad and Jordan, very big deposits of oil have been found. We will be able, as well as having done what we've done, offering Iraq a federal constitution and having held 2 elections, to point out to people that the material basis, the actual economic basis for a federalism now exists. There could be an oil splitting, an oil sharing law. In fact, we're within measurable distance of getting one of those through the Iraqi parliament. I think that's a tremendous achievement, both in stabilizing and civilizing the region and in making sure that those resources are not controlled by criminals and fascists.
Well, what about the fact that the multinational corporations want to go in and expatriate 75% of the oil? And don't you think
still in advance on having all of it owned by one family? It couldn't be more privatized than when everything in the country belonged to Saddam Hussein.
Christopher Hitchens, this idea that you should be able to invade another country because you think that country is going to be traumatized anyway, and you kind of preemptively go in to make the trauma less, is kind of a difficult proposition, though, because you never know how much trauma you're going to impose, and the United States has imposed a lot of trauma.
Doesn't
that concern you?
It's true you can't know that in advance, but I think the principle is a defensible one. I mean, look, if we had lived up to our promises about Rwanda, which everyone now wishes, well, perhaps not everyone, I don't know what your view is, but a lot of people do feel ashamed of our failure to act on what was a clear appeal from the UN commander on the ground to stop it. Now, I don't know what would have happened, but I'm pretty sure that we would have seen American soldiers, because it would have had to be the United States that led the intervention, maybe firing into crowds of armed Hutu militia. Could well have happened. We don't know. All kinds of things could be on our conscience by now, but I don't think it could possibly have been worse than what did eventuate when we stood there with our arms folded.
But look what happened to Iraq, and between 75,000 and maybe 10 times that number of Iraqi civilians killed. That's worse than a lot of people imagine.
Yes, but killed by
than you imagine.
Killed by the forces of our worst enemy, our worst current enemy, the forces of jihad, the parties of God, the vilest and cruelest and most unscrupulous enemy.
Well, Iraq body count
an enemy that we are committed to fighting everywhere as it is, in my opinion.
I mean, I don't think you can attribute all those deaths to the extremists. I mean, IraqBodyCount.net says 75,000 are a direct result of U.S. or British attacks.
I don't see how that can possibly be known.